Thanks everybody for coming in for another episode of Compound Performance Radio. I'm Kyle.
I'm Matt.
And we've got Dr. Jared Boyd with us. And, Jared, you can go ahead and probably, introduce yourself better than we can, but we're really excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, I'm excited for you guys for having me on. I appreciate that. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I am Jared Boyd. I'm a physical therapist, athletic trainer, strength and conditioning coach, and a board certified specialist in sports physical therapy. Currently working with the Memphis Grizzlies of the NBA. So I'm a performance therapist for them. Been here for a year and a half, I want to say. Prior to this, I had a very, very brief stint with the military as a civilian physical therapist. And then before that, I was 3 years at a sports outpatient orthopedic physical therapy clinic called Rehab to Perform in Frederick, Maryland. So kind of a little bit about me and kind of my matriculation to where I currently am.
Yeah. So we were kind of talking about this off air, but like if we look at your career trajectory and career path, it's like what every aspiring college student who's in like strength and conditioning or exercise science like wants to be. Like they would just look at you and be like, that's the guy, that's what I want to do. Like he's a strength and conditioning coach for like the NBA. He does PT, physical therapy work with them. Like, how did you decide that this was going to be the path that you wanted to take? And what were some of the steps that you took to get to where you are?
Yeah, man, that's a good question. It's one that I'm still trying to process, of like, how did I actually get here? And I feel like we can always like tell ourselves whatever story that we want to tell ourselves in regard to the things that we believe got us to where we are. But I guess if I had to give some kind of a concrete, tangible answer, it would be, for me, having some semblance of like a goal or goals in place, of a process or a plan, but understanding that I would probably have to have different iterations of that plan evolve over time, because we already know, that you could set forth this ideal program, even in regard to training, right? We could set forth this ideal periodization program, but a lot of times we have to be amenable to change. So it has to be more agile. And I think that's the same for our professional landscape as well when we're trying to get to a certain career path. So for me, it was understanding that, hey, I wanted to be a physical therapist. So I majored in exercise science in undergrad. And then from there, I had the opportunity to go to school at Shenandoah University, where they offered a dual degree track where I was able to get my doctorate in physical therapy and my master's in athletic training. Mm-hmm. And I think it was around that time, once we started to have our clinical rotations, that I was incredibly intentional and purposeful about selecting clinical rotations that I thought would be more suitable for me and kind of aligned with where I potentially would want to go upon graduation. So having clinicals at EXOS, University of Tennessee, their athletic department, and then the United States Air Force Academy. I think all of those things really gave me a better premise and landscape for how to navigate and negotiate, the reconditioning process and physical preparation. And so I think with all those skills, it just opened up a little bit more lanes for me to be able to traverse in and not really putting myself in this one siloed position. And then I would say, as I started to get into the workforce with my first job, I saw some things that I didn't necessarily prefer. And so I said, all right, well, how can I better set myself up for success by making sure that I can actually put to use the skills that I have? And so I started really just reaching out to different clinics. And I think that's another thing too. Like a lot of the positions that I've had the opportunity to have were bestowed upon me by taking initiative to reach out to those places, even if I didn't see anything on Indeed, right? It's like, hey, I'm just going to reach out, introduce myself. I'm going to attach my CV or my resume. And a lot of places ended up reaching back out. And one of those places was Rehab to Perform. And that's when I started there for those 3 years. And I started to, from there, curate my social media. And that's how I got kind of noticed upon other things, but that was one of the reasons why I got noticed in regard to the job that I currently have with the Memphis Grizzlies. So I think it's all about, obviously, people say it's who you know, but it's also who knows you. And so if you want people to know you, you have to kind of be willing to be vulnerable and put yourself out there and put your work out there and network and connect. But then also making sure that not every opportunity is always going to be presented to you. You have to make sure that you're willing to just reach out to people. And sometimes, you might not necessarily yield the outcomes that you're looking for, but if you keep on trying that, then I would have to imagine that something beneficial is going to be the end result of those continued, exposures to reaching out to different companies and people.
I genuinely hope that everybody listening to that listens to that twice.
Yeah, rewind that, take notes, write it down.
That's I think, because that is a huge misconception, I think, in the industry, that a lot of people, I think, kind of wait around for the opportunity to come to them. Right. And that's probably even just like more of a human condition, more so than anything else. Right. But I think in the industry, for sure, we see that expressed a lot, where people are posting on social media, or maybe they're in like a corporate gym and they're training their clients. Like, oh yeah, like that, my next client's just going to see me like working with this person, and they're just going to come up to me and like hand me their credit card and, want to start training. Right. Or they're going to see my post and shoot me a DM or whatever. And the reality of it is, whether it's marketing or whether it's just reaching out and to different companies and to different organizations, like that's something that you have to be super proactive about in this field, whether it's strength and conditioning or just personal training or whatever, because it is incredibly saturated and competitive now. I think, especially with the rise of technology and social media, even more so, than when I got into it, for sure. So that's a huge thing.
I also really like what you said about it's not about who you know, it's about who knows you as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a really, really, really good point for the people who are looking at things and not wanting to do things like you did, where they're curating a social media platform or they're doing something like that, because right now that's the easiest way for people to get out there. And if you are continuously putting your best foot forward on social media and trying to show people the best that you can offer on social media now, it's kind of like what happened with you. It opens a lot of other doors because people now have another thing that they can look at to see, okay, what's this guy about?
Yeah, 100%, man. It really is. And it's just, it's for me, my intention, when I try to put together some semblance of a successful, whatever that means, social media page on Instagram, it wasn't with the intention of me really landing this specific job, but it was more so for me just to really put my thoughts out there, to critically think, to have my thought processes appraised by my peers, so that I can learn and unlearn different biases and get better as often as I possibly could. But then also, as you both already alluded to, a means in which I could truly start to expand my network, and kind of discover what other people were doing and what they were thinking about. So I think if you approach it that way, as a byproduct, the other things will come along for the ride inherently.
Yeah. Authenticity is a major thing in there. I think looking at, where you're at now, it's amazing because the whole Memphis staff is like, for me, like that's the dream team of MBA. It's like, I'm a big fan of everybody on that staff, whether it's Chris or Eric or whoever, it is just, when I saw you land there, it's just like, wow, like that's amazing. And I think that's something that, looking at the industry in general and kind of looking at what your last year's been with, obviously, COVID, and you've had 2 seasons and like a super condensed off season. And I know that's going to affect your athletes as well. Like, what's that? I mean, what's your day to day? And obviously that's a broad statement, but kind of what's your day to day kind of look like? What are your roles and responsibilities? Because I also don't think everybody probably knows the different parts that you all play, kind of when working with athletes, and what, your role as a physical therapist as well. Kind of, if you could walk us through that, I think that'd be really awesome.
Absolutely, for sure. I would say in general, when we look at most organizations, you're going to be delineated into two overarching departments. One is going to be more performance oriented. One is going to be more medical oriented. So, medicine, I'm thinking more of the reconditioning. So if an athlete sustains some kind of a time loss or an extended time loss injury, or they have some kind of a post-surgical surgery or procedure that's done, then they're likely going to spend more time under the domain of sports medicine, as opposed to if we look at the off season or even in season where we're trying to maintain, they're likely going to spend more time under the domain of sports performance, while also understanding that there has to be some kind of a symbiotic relationship between both of those, because of the fact that a physical therapist and a strength coach may be sharing an athlete. So making sure that we have just concise communication and we're succinct about, what our objective key results or our key performance indicators are for the season is going to be pivotal for the success of the athletes. So I think that's always important to keep in mind in regard to understanding, again, what our intentions are and making sure that we're navigating the communication appropriately. But in regard to the specifics, at least under sports medicine, our goal is really, when I think about, and this might not necessarily be, as you talked about, Kyle, like ubiquitous to all organizations, but I could, speak for us if I'm giving just a bird's eye view, that our main mission is to really try to resolve or reduce some of the more basal level constraints of the organism in regard to do they possess the joint potentials or joint potential, do they possess basal level constituents from a isolated capacity perspective to then be able to integrate those more basal level affordances into something that manifests as a more integrated emergent kind of output, or something where they're actually trying to increase the expression of force or increase the expression of the rate of force, right? So any kind of iteration of strength over a varying time scale. But sometimes there might be different hindrances or constraints that will preclude them from being able to gain a trainable or a loadable, adaptable movement. Then it's incumbent on us in our department to make sure that we kind of discover what is precluding them from doing so, and then equipping them with the solutions to be able to kind of coordinate those patterns together to something that is quote unquote functional, whatever that is as well, which we can get into later. But I guess that's when I look at roles and responsibilities, that's kind of how I would delineate those two domains. And then in regard to just the day-to-day, a lot of it is in season and out of season is completely different. In season, I kind of think about it, and I had a post about this, but in season is like we're trying to stave off or decrease the rate at which we're going downhill. Mm-hmm. So in the off season, the goal is to build the peak or increase the height of the mountain so that it takes longer to come back down in the in season. Because in the in season, we think about the magnitude and the rate of stressors that they're exposed to in regard to the amount of games, 82 games. This season it's 72, it's a little bit more condensed. But the amount of games, the density of games, meaning back-to-backs, the travel as well, which is going to really challenge the central nervous system, autonomic systems in regard to potential deprivation of sleep and just trying to negotiate time changes as well. All those things are going to be added stressors into their stress capacity. So it's really going to be challenging for us to impart some kind of a stressor to say, hey, we're going to build strength or we're going to build power because it's going to be hard for their system to really gain enough of exposure to that to truly adapt to that particular stimulus, because they're trying to really refine themselves from the stressors of the game night in and night out. So I would say that's the big difference in regard to in season versus off season. So right now it's really just about management or maintenance, as well as making sure that we're doing a decent job at quote unquote load management. And a lot of that also has to do with communication and just this hierarchy of what that individual in front of us at that given time needs from a perspective of psychological, physical, or social types of environments that will help them to negate or combat some of the challenges from the frequent exposure of stressors from the basketball games. So that's kind of, I guess, a little bit of an aerial view of the day-to-day, but hopefully that kind of answers the question to a certain extent.
Yeah, I've always kind of made that reminds me of kind of a micro example that I've always used with people as far as like, think about like 100-meter, race, right? Where athletes are really, accelerating to a peak velocity. And then it's basically who can decelerate the slowest, is going to be your winner at that point after, that kind of 30-40 meter acceleration phase of that race. And I think that makes a lot of sense from a macro standpoint, as far as how you're looking at the duration of a season and managing, athletes from that perspective. And obviously you have athletes who play every game all game, right. And then you've got athletes who are, kind of on the end of the bench. Maybe your younger players or people who are just in a role player role. And from a training perspective, and I know you're like, that's probably more on the performance side, but what is kind of their training and conditioning look like? What are the differences there as far as like volume? Because even with all the travel and everything else, like that always kind of mystifies me as far as like, how do you sneak that stuff in? Like,
yeah, for sure. Good question. I would say, a lot of times the biggest factor, if we look at all the different variables that we can manipulate within a training program, is going to be frequency. I think is going to be key, but then the other dials that we can maybe turn to up the volume or decrease the volume in regard to adaptation or maladaptation, which we obviously don't want, would be the intensity or the volume. So the biggest difference with those who are getting more minutes versus those who aren't is probably going to be the volume. So we want to try to maintain some degree of intensity, but maybe not at the same volume for someone who is being exposed to games versus someone who doesn't get a lot of minutes or perhaps might not play that season because they're more so on like the skill acquisition part where they aren't quite there yet, but maybe in a year or two they might get more exposure to higher frequency in regards to the amount of games that they're playing. So it's like, well, for them, the intensity is going to be moderate to high for sure, because that's what's going to truly drive the adaptations, again, from a biomotor perspective, meaning strength, power, speed, those things. But the volume, I think, is also going to be higher because they can afford that volume since they have the capacity to probably recover from those frequent exposures, as opposed to the individuals who are currently playing. Volume might overflow or exceed their stress bucket, so to speak. And so the big thing to make sure we maintain some semblance of whether it's tendon health or the reservation of strength, meaning force production, or their power, making sure how do we truly mitigate the decrement in those biological constituents, probably going to be some relevant dosage of intensity in regard to their lifts.
Now, following up on that, I would just be curious of how much does exercise selection play a role in that? Do you change exercise selection for the person to either increase or dial up or dial down the intensity and volume? Or do you pretty much have them do fairly similar things based obviously off of their individuality and their individual differences? But do you change and vary exercise selection for people based off of where they are in the season and what they need?
Yeah, I would say the first priority would probably be, if we look at it from like a hierarchy of needs, would be, as you said, what are their current constraints? What are they potentially challenged by? And what is limiting their expression of being able to handle said intensity? So if something's precluding them and they don't have the affordances necessary for a movement, even though we believe that movement to be a suitable type of modality, whether it's, let's say, a barbell back squat, for example, which a lot of basketball athletes probably don't have the muscular or musculoskeletal apparatus to do efficiently or effectively, then we would scale down or regress to the next tier of a movement that would be a better, more valuable option for them to still get a sufficient stimulus. So I think that's the first priority, is understanding what their their rate limiters are from a movement perspective. And then from there, it's going to be what is going to be the potential. This is probably theoretical, but what's the potential cost of a movement, right? So if we look at something like a back squat versus a hack squat, then we could surmise potentially, again, theoretically, that a back squat might be a little bit more challenging and require an extended period of time to recover from, as opposed to the hack squat, where we can truly isolate, even though it's an integrated compound movement, there's not this axial load. And so we can still, to a better degree, make sure that we're allocating the stress to the quads or to the glutes, whatever kind of tissue we think needs to be augmented, as opposed to something that maybe has more complexity. I think more complexity is going to be more costly from a cognitive perspective, and also certain ramifications that could potentially be disadvantageous for the organism. So I do think that the exercise selection does matter in regard to what we think that stressor would impart on the individual. But a lot of it, I would say, first is going to be based off of a potential evaluation of what they possess and what they don't possess, and constructing something that yields the best outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that, because I mean, that goes along with a lot of the things that we talk with people about, as far as, complexity and intensity, especially if intensity is what you want to drive, are going to have an inverse relationship.
Yeah,
almost all the time, right? Outside of some very select scenarios, because of the cognitive demand, because of the skill acquisition. And, so it's like, I love that approach, where it's just finding the right tool for the job, for the right person, and understanding what variable you're actually trying to drive, and doing that in a more acute manner, potentially, and even the assessing cost portion, I think, is, again, it might be theoretical, but I think we can also, if we're looking at a hack squat versus a barbell back squat, like, I do think, we can make a pretty high assumptive guess that a back squat is going to have more potential just systemic cost than what that's going to look like from a hack squat from that perspective. And
particularly with the NBA players who are over 6'6", like, you watch them squat.
Yeah. Your shortest player is 6'4", right? With long femurs, it's,
the amount of work that they're doing, right, is going to be way more. We look at force times distance, so they're traveling more distance. So there's obviously inherently more work that's being imparted on their system and or those tissues.
Yeah. So
just want a quick aside that because I'm over 6 foot, Jared Boyd just gave me the reason why I'm weak in the squat. So it's okay, everybody. It's science. That's why I'm so weak.
Matt finally got a good excuse for that.
Yes,
as did I. It's like Matt calls his squat weak, and on a podcast that I'm on, basically just to troll me, I'm pretty sure. But
I can attest that neither one of you are weak. I've seen your Instagrams. It is phenomenal. Yeah, y'all move some weight for sure.
I do have one question for you at the very end that you and I have to discuss and cover. So we'll get there. It's related.
All right.
When Matt says that, it kind of scares me sometimes. That's okay. We're gonna roll with it. So I think, bridging into kind of the second topic we wanted to talk about was just even like the broader strength and conditioning, field. And, we talked off air about this a little bit, but in addition to all the work you're doing with the NBA, like, you still also work in an educational perspective as well, a little bit too, and which I think is phenomenal. Education is something that I think we all hold really dear, and something that we have a lot of respect for. So just from an industry perspective, like, what do you kind of see as maybe the trends and the things that are kind of moving in a direction that, again, like, you like to see, versus some of the things that maybe aren't from that perspective?
Yeah, for sure. I guess, I love that question. When I think about that, I look at what are the things that are incredibly polarizing, or the topics that create a lot of divisiveness, where there's a lot of disagreement, and we get into these tribes, which there's nothing necessarily innately wrong with tribes, because of the fact that they've been around for forever and they're part of evolution, and I think they are important for sure. But sometimes if we're not aware of the potential ramifications of the tribes and the different biases that they lead to, we can find ourselves in tough situations where we are being incredibly siloed. We aren't opening up our funnel to receive information that might counter our specific biases. So I kind of approach it from that premise and say, what are and why are certain topics incredibly challenging for people to have a civil conversation about, or be judicious about. And I would say one of them, which probably will always exist, is going to be this premise of functional. And I've been on this for, I don't know, maybe like the past 6 months. I've really been thinking about like functional, what it actually means, from like, what is your operational definition of functional, as well as, I've been thinking about that concept, operational definition, being applied to other words as well that seem to have this nebulous type of connotation associated with it, because I think it'll allow us to truly have a better dialogue with individuals, because we might potentially agree with similar methods and strategies, or maybe we don't. And it's all because of the fact that we are on a starting ground where we have different operational definitions. So I think it's important first to discover what that is yourself, and then present that to the table to get on a better starting ground for having a more conducive conversation. So one of those is what is functional, as well as thinking about these concepts of kinematics and kinetics in regard to kinetics. I'm thinking of capacity, or these biological biomotor capabilities of force expression, or strength, power, speed, as opposed to the kinematics are going to be perhaps the way in which a movement manifests itself, or form or technique, etc. And I've really been thinking about this because there seems to be, these, as with everything, there's a continuum, but we kind of make this binary bias that there's only two options. So you either have to be on the camp that supports kinetics and just force, right? And load is the end all be all. Or you're on the other side of the coin where it's going to be specifically kinematics. So how something looks and how the person moves. And I think that's a false sense of understanding this complexity, because we're simplifying it and we are reducing it down to something that I think is trying to help us in a sense, but I think in all actuality, it kind of harms us, because again, it does preclude us from being able to truly ensure that our patients, athletes, clients can get back to their required and desired activities, because we might miss the boat sometimes. And so for me, when I think about all of this, it all comes back to, like, obviously we can get into the specifics of, the kinematics and the kinetics question and what functional actually is, and dynamic correspondence, but it all comes back to asking yourself, what is my epistemology? Meaning, like, why do I believe X, Y, and Z? I think that's incredibly important to, just really start to journal and write down, why do I practice this, or why do I give these specific narratives to my clientele, and then also thinking about what are the benefits of this, but then what's another lens that I can look at to have gotten to a similar conclusion or outcome. What's an alternative hypothesis? So if I'm seeing someone that's coming in with a particular injury or ache or pain, whatever it may be, if I come up with an initial hypothesis, maybe taking a step back to continue to refine and self-appraise that process, to say, okay, well, this is another potential hypothesis that might be a viable option in regard to why they have this manifestation of pain or injury. So I guess, and hopefully I'm not being too tangential here, but I think for me, that's incredibly important is to really, I'm having recency bias, but I just read Adam Grant's new book called Think Again. And it really just prompted me to understand that it's not all about trying to acquire information and acquire knowledge, but sometimes the process is about unlearning and rethinking the different types of information that was disseminated upon you so that you can reflect and refine and iterate in a more appropriate direction with more credence behind the decisions that you're making, as well as having, again, a more judicious debate with people and being potentially more amenable to their thoughts and their perspectives, because you could maybe add some of that in to your practice. And again, it could yield more efficacious outcomes.
I think that's a really interesting thing that you said towards the end there, where you're talking about unlearning things.
Yes.
So what is your internal audit process for information that you've taken?
Yeah, I think for me, it's going to be probably three things. One of them is going to be truly like writing. I have notebooks literally everywhere. So I'm trying to do this year, like spend a better time of getting some kind of a platform, like technology platform or whatever it may be, to actually put all my notebooks, just compile them and condense them into one isolated platform where I can easily allocate it. But with that being said, I have a lot of notebooks, and what I do is just write out my thoughts. And I'll write out just different perspectives, different theories, different things that come from the research, thoughts that are in my head, biases. I'll write those out. And then what I try to do is go to the literature to see if I can find things that not only, support, but also things and evidence that may not support the information that I've written down, just to see the subtle nuances and the contingencies that oppose my potential biases. And then another thing that I do, like I said, is writing those things out and giving it to the world, because it does no good to only self-appraise yourself, because again, we're going to try to quell some of our vulnerability by making ourselves seem like, oh no, that was good. Like, good job, Jared. That was like solid, man. You're a smart guy. You know what I mean? But I think some of that we can resolve by truly just putting ourselves out there into the ether. And so that's where the social media could come in handy, or just having a circle of people that aren't like your yes man, but they're more so people that are giving you some sense of doubt. So they're good at asking questions that truly do make you rethink. And I think that's what we do a good job at in regard to the Grizzlies. Like, we have a very good group that imparts this critical thinking. And it's not necessarily about breaking people down, but it's trying to get to better solutions or trying to be less wrong as often as we possibly can. So that's kind of, what I often think about and my go-to in regard to self-auditing my progress for unlearning certain concepts.
Follow up to that, how hard of a skill was that for you to learn, and how challenging was that for you in the very beginning, when it was like you would go through, would you ever go through things like sunk cost bias, where you would look at what you've gone through and be like, oh man, I just wasted all this time and money on this and now it's useless? Oh
yeah. I mean, for 100%, like, without question, I love that. I love all those different biases and fallacies. I definitely have done that. And it was challenging, but I guess what I try to also do with that is to say, all right, well, it's important to realize that even though as we progress and we're unlearning and rethinking and acquiring a different lens in which to view the world or the people in which we work with, it doesn't mean that because we are maybe not using other methods that we once used because we feel as though they might not be that beneficial or conducive or credible, doesn't mean that they were simply useless or futile. I think what it means is that we should, for one, look at the commonalities with those past methods and strategies and techniques with the current ones that we practice, and say, hey, what's the common link here? Because a lot of these different these different camps, if you will, or tribes, whether it is something like a PRI or FRC or DNS, SFMA, they share a lot of commonalities, but we often look at the dissimilarities between them, and that's what creates the tribes and the divisiveness. So for me, it's like, okay, well, that's, and this past iteration of what I used to do is similar to what I currently do in this particular regard. I'm going to make sure that I investigate this a little bit more, because perhaps that's a staple principle, that's a non-negotiable that I should better understand and harness moving forward. So it gives me a little bit more, I don't want to say certainty, because I'm not sure certainty is something that we should be aiming for, but it allows me to feel, I guess, a little more secure in the decisions that I'm making, and that they're grounded maybe in a little bit more of this, a little bit more in credible evidence or literature or laws within the scientific world. So I think that helps a lot. And then also just the process of, you know that you are inherently growing throughout this entire process, right? So just because, again, you're leaving things off the table as you discover that they might not be beneficial, it's for me, I don't really get upset about that and say, oh man, like I wasted a ton of time, because I know that my ability to discern what's important has grown and evolved, and inherently I've grown and evolved as a person or as a clinician, so that in the future I may be a little bit more equipped with navigating the complexity, or discovering something that is or is not going to be beneficial.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that's a great way of explaining it. And because I think we all go through that, we've all done a lot of acronyms, at this point in our lives. And the way that I typically look at it too is, even all experiences, reflect within our perceptions, right? So they all influence how we view everything moving forward, whether it's, again, negatively or positively impactful at that point. And in finding similarities within these systems is something that I think, most coaches should probably try to do, because, like you said, we focus on the differentiators because that's marketing, right? That's how we do. That's how we get allocation of resources, which is the coaches. That's the consumers. These are all companies and their brands, and they've all got the same pool that they're fishing out of. And it doesn't do anybody any good to say, oh yeah, we agree with you on that. That's something that we can all, shake hands on and give each other high fives. We always want to point out the differences there. And when I start looking at that from an industry perspective, it's whether you're on social media or you're at a conference or you're talking to your friends in the industry that might be in a different camp, the majority of the arguments and the majority of the conversations we have from that standpoint are really about minutia, in most cases, in my experience. And also, just like you said, even just a lack of context, right? And that's something that Matt and I talk about a lot, because we work with, Matt works with literally some of the strongest people in the world from a powerlifting perspective. And I work with 2 triathletes right now, right? And the systems and the tools that we use are going to be incredibly different from an intervention perspective, just based on those task demands being so completely opposite, in reality, right? So saying that a system is beneficial in one realm and saying that it's not necessarily beneficial in another realm doesn't define its utility from a good or bad standpoint. It just brings context to where we can actually utilize those things the correct way. And what I see mostly in the industry, more so than things being good or bad, is just misapplication, right? And that's something that we have so many conversations about, just between the two of us, mostly ranting and making not in a dignified way like this.
We wouldn't record those ones.
We wouldn't record those with some people. But I just think that's an amazing, explanation of that, because I think the industry needs to hear that. People who listen to this, I think, really need to hear that, because the dogma and the silos are obviously super prevalent, and that's what we see so much of.
And I think it circles back really nicely to something you were talking about earlier, where if you're talking about people with different practitioners who have different acronyms, they maybe like arguing the same concept with a totally different definition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a hugely important point that you brought up earlier, is like, if you can talk to somebody and you can work on identifying the definition of terms and understanding what that person means by neutral spine, full range of motion, or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
then you can find the common ground to have an actual conversation, as opposed to just arguing about like your nuance is better than their nuance, or like your context is better than their context. You can have a better conversation, and you can have you can have a better relationship with those people based off of that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it really is, because even thinking about, like, okay, so we'll I guess we can get into the weeds a little bit with functional. So it's like, I feel that most people, I don't want to say most people, because that's overtly generalizing, but I believe that there are some people within our industries that will view the word functional as something that they observe as being similar to the emergent task, or the terminal task, meaning the kinematics are closely linked to what that individual is going to have to eventually do upon their release into the wild, right? So it's like, all right, well, while that is not inherently wrong or false premise, it does leave a lot left to be desired in regard to the word or the operational definition of function, because we might not necessarily restore the most necessary constituents that will serve that individual the most success upon their release into the wild. So what I mean is that my operational definition of functional is going to be to provide the organism with the necessary affordances, or trying to reduce potential constraints in order to amalgamate those variables with other variables into the final solution to be successful for their required and desired activities. So if we take a specific example and we look at, let's say, someone with anterior knee pain or ACL reconstruction, there's a lot that's been, permeating throughout our industry in regard to something as simple as a leg extension exercise. Some camps may deem that as not being a viable option because of the fact that it doesn't simulate the same kinematics or the representativeness that field athlete would need to demonstrate if they're back into the game. And so what I would say is, well, if we were to only emulate and have this dynamic correspondence of those kinematic variables, we might actually not impart the stress to that tissue, because we know with dynamic systems theory that people are going to potentially be able to achieve the dynamic terminal task, but perhaps with a strategy that we don't deem as being successful for the long run, or it does not integrate the isolated tissue back into the equation to make sure that person is quote unquote robust. And so if we can look at perhaps function from that premise, then I think it will allow us to maybe have a little less divisiveness in regard to isolated versus integrated and compound exercises. That, hey, this is just a snapshot in their entire program, that we're going to do these leg extensions right now to make sure we can isolate the tissue, we can impart and allocate the stressor there, we can increase the cross-section area, mitigate atrophy, increase the isolated production of rate coding, and limit their aversion to stress and load, so that when they get back into an integrated activity, especially something emergent like deceleration, we know that they have the necessary requisite capabilities. And if they still have some kinematic deviation from what we deem as being normal, we know that it's not because it's a lack of strength. So we can remove that as being a potential hindrance and say, okay, well, now what are the other potential constraints that are precluding them from being able to demonstrate the kinematics that they need to be successful for that activity.
And I think that's an awesome answer to that. And one of the things that I've always seen is when something like that happens, or when you're doing things like that with people, the I've had multiple conversations with people where the answer is just always, well, that we don't want to train bodybuilders. It's like a leg extension doesn't mean, just because we're doing leg extensions doesn't mean I'm like trying to train IFBB pro. Like we're just trying to build up some bodies. Like, and I like, how do you, have you ever had like experience that, or like dealt with that with other practitioners, like on social media or anything like that? And if so, like how do you deal with the fact that, like, if you're looking at biomechanics apparently only matter for bodybuilders, and it's quote unquote functional movement for everybody else?
Yeah. Oh, I'm with you on that one. I would say, it kind of goes back, and this is probably with everything in regards to those challenging conversations of asking how and why. So, why do you believe this? And then how would you explain your theory or your premise in regard to, how does it actually work or manifest itself? And then lastly, what would potentially dissuade you, or maybe a better word is persuade you to maybe starting to accept some of the concepts that I'm trying to employ or impart. So I think that kind of gives you some degree of understanding whether or not, for one, it's even worth your time and effort and energy to engage in that conversation, right? But then two, to truly see if that person is open and receptive to having a cordial conversation. So that's kind of where I start. And then instead of, I'm guilty of like initially just bestowing a lot of like literature and evidence at people. But then it's like, well, okay, if you actually read the evidence about disseminating evidence, it's actually not that beneficial for changing people's beliefs and their behaviors anyway. So it's like, all right, well, let me use those other strategies and let me be the first one to kind of be the catalyst for getting them to change their thoughts by saying, hey, okay, I understand what you're saying about X, Y, and Z being functional. I do think that, whatever it is that they're claiming to be functional is, right? I do think that this integrated compound, emergent, reactive, reflexive, whatever movement is functional and is an additive piece because of X, Y, and Z. And I also think that what I'm claiming to be functional could also be a part of that equation and the solution as well because of X, Y, and Z. What are your thoughts? So something like that, I think, can open up a better table for people to have a more symbiotic relationship moving forward in regard to the different professions.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And even circling back, I think another part of that answer a couple of answers ago that really caught my ear, I think, is looking at the athlete's ability to self-organize, especially at the high level athletes that you're working with, where just because somebody completes a task doesn't mean that it's repeatable long term and it's done with the same efficiency that you're looking for from a motor perspective or a biomechanical perspective, or even from a stress and stimulus perspective to their goal from a in-game scenario versus like maybe a more predictive practice scenario. Is someone who, like, I played, small college basketball, and it's like, okay, like you're in practice, like a lot of it is very predictable. Like, the drills you're running, there's no reactive component really to it. And it's very easy to kind of go through some of these like rehearsed, 3 dribble pull-ups or, some of the post drills that you might be going through, or even, defensive things. It's very different in game where you have to be tactical and reactive to 9 other people on a court. Right.
Yeah.
And it is the dynamic system, and you're dealing with fatigue management versus the fourth quarter versus the first quarter. Right. Or different stressors. Like it's a 2-point game versus a 10-point game. You're at home, you're on the road. And I think that's where, like self-organization is something that a lot of people only think of from a biomechanical perspective, but there's so many covariants that are going to go into that process, and looking at rehab or performance from that perspective. Like for me, it's really easy to just get like caught staring into the abyss from my, in my experience.
No, I love it, all of what you just said, because it is this confluence of so many different variables that go into, the recipe. And sometimes, I also think that some people, it's either, again, everything is a spectrum or a continuum, but we either find ourselves at one of the two ends of the continuums, and not necessarily living in the middle where we should be perhaps more ambivalent. And so sometimes people that are perhaps aware of all the different covariants will adopt this mindset of holistic health. Mm-hmm. And I understand where that comes from, but it potentially could have some downside or some ramifications as well, because if we try to extend or expand our lens, right, don't miss the forest for the trees, like this concept, then what we potentially could do is just throw the kitchen sink at a problem, because if we look at it through the lens of, oh, it's holistic and everything matters and it's all these different variables, which yes, everything does matter, but it doesn't mean that it's imperative on us to truly try to triage that particular variable. What happens, I think, is that we leave one bucket that might have been the most pivotal bucket. We leave that something to be desired to be fulfilled, right? It's like, all right, well, if we understand that this individual probably just, I don't want to say just needed, but could have been very successful with having more of their allocation and time and energy concerted to increasing cross-sectional area of the quads, right? Thinking post-op ACL again as an example, then I think we're better suited, as opposed to where everything matters. So we'll do a little bit of quad, then we'll do a little bit of gastroc soleus, and we'll do a little bit of reactive stuff, and we'll do a little bit of this, because we understand this concept of dynamic systems theory. And we think we can outsmart it by trying to make sure we manage every covariant. I think we can find ourselves down a slippery slope with that premise. Again, understanding and appreciating the perspective in which people have in regard to looking at it that way. But then on the flip side, we could have people that don't understand the dynamic systems theory at all, and so we become incredibly overtly reductionist in our thinking, and we don't see all the other ways in which a movement may manifest. And so I think it's important to just be mindful of both of those and keep our peripheries open, but kind of remaining in the middle.
That does not sell on the internet, Jared.
No.
It doesn't.
You're never a concrete answer now.
You're never gonna get 100,000 followers.
Nope.
I'm really. So you know what? I really think that's why I don't. I think that's why I don't have. People will randomly ask me. They'll be like, "Why don't you have more followers?" Or why don't I'm like, it's not really my priority per se. But I also think one hindrance is because of the fact that I'm not incredibly hyperbolic with my statements.
Absolutely.
And I do kind of leave this level of, I'm not quite, it's like, that's just not who I am. I just want to curate critical thinking, and I'm a critical thinker, and I don't have the answer. So it's important to have doubt, have humility, and have curiosity, as opposed to having this prideful conviction and overconfidence.
Yeah, you're just not polarizing enough. You're a nice guy who questions himself and is humble in the industry. It's like, that's just never gonna fly from a marketing perspective.
It's hard for people to share it, because I can't argue with him. He doesn't. He's arguing with himself in the comments. Like,
you need a better PR person. Yeah, that's all you need.
I do.
We just need text boxes with one sentence captions that are just I hate you because of this.
Let's blast them. Let's blast them. So, I mean, that does lead us into our last question, and this is one that we ask everybody, so it's always kind of fun. But in the industry that you see, whether it's in person, in live within your section of the industry, or as a social media just phenomenon or whatever, what are the things that kind of what do you hate? Like, what grinds your gears? Like, what are the things that you just see and you're like, ugh, that again?
Yeah.
Like that type of thing.
Yeah. Ooh. Oh, man.
Long list.
Yeah. That's
name names if you want to.
Oh, no. I guess probably for me, a concept where, and I'm blanking on the name, but it'll probably come to me. Watch it'll come to me when we're done with this. But essentially, it's where, when people post an exercise or they post a statement, essentially they're promulgating some piece of information about or representative of their beliefs or their biases and their behaviors. And other parties may castigate and denigrate that person for being vulnerable and willing to share where they are. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I really don't prefer about that is that we've all been somewhere where we have held on to different beliefs or ideologies or information that might not have been credible or might not have been the most appropriate at any given time. So instead of, giving that individual some degree of like, hey, I understand where they're coming from. I can understand, why they may think X, Y, and Z, especially individuals that are currently in school. And they're just trying to learn, and they're going through this matriculation process from a knowledge acquisition and trying to understand how to integrate all this information that's disseminated upon them. And along that road to quote unquote success and mastery of whatever kind of skill that you're going for, there's going to be bumps in the road, and those bumps are vital. They're essential for truly learning, because learning isn't this linear process where we always are successful. That's the opposite of learning. So learning has to have some degree of us having unsuccessful attempts. And so when we break those people down, or again, we castigate them, then I think we're doing a disservice perhaps to their learning, because we may make them feel less inclined to putting their self out there and being willing to be vulnerable. But we also may make them more defensive and hold on to their beliefs even stronger. So we don't actually prompt them to truly rethink, right? So it's this cognitive dissonance kind of mindset. So for me, I think that's the part of false, I think it's called false attribution error, false attribution error, false attribution bias. But essentially it's where we're looking at people's behaviors as a consequence of who they actually like as their personality, as opposed to it being situational. So we're looking at it as, oh, well, they're just not smart, right? Or they're just not equipped enough to understand this. Why do they still preach this? Why are they posting this? As opposed to it being, well, perhaps it's the school that they went to that taught them this information. It's just going to take them a little bit longer to get integrated within the workforce, to then be able to ascertain different modes of thinking and different schools of thought. So I think for me, that's the thing that I really, really don't like within our industry, because it is just so profound how often I see that. And it's like, well, you were there before too, right? Like you didn't know every single thing 5 years ago, 10 years ago, So I try to keep that in mind when I see things that I might not necessarily prefer, because if I look back on my Instagram or an article that I wrote or a blog that I did or listen to a podcast I did years ago, I would probably say, what the hell was I talking about? What the hell was I doing? And that's a good thing, because it means that we've grown.
Yeah. I can't listen to podcasts I did 2 years ago. I'm just like, oh man. Sometimes people even still like post them like in their stories. I'm like, yeah, like don't listen to that one.
Yeah, I've had that a couple times. I just don't reshare that one.
Yeah,
I can't.
I was in a dark place in my life. It was in a different spot. Yeah. I think that was really good, and probably the most diplomatic answer that we've gotten so far. So I appreciate that as well, because it's easy to sit here as someone who's been in the industry for 15 years and act like I'm all high and mighty, but man, I've promoted some stuff now, in the past with full confidence, probably too much confidence, that I look back and I'm like, oh, that just wasn't even right in the context that I was promoting it, at the time, based on the information I have now. And that's something I always try to, remember with people too, is it's like, we're all hopefully just trying to do the best we can with what we have available to us. Yeah.
So I had one question that I alluded to earlier that I need to bring up. Yeah. So it is about social media and it is about Instagram. So if you guys don't follow Dr. Boyd on Instagram, you guys are missing out on something, because he's an epic lip syncer.
Yes.
And I'm looking at your story highlight right now, and the last one you did was 32 weeks ago.
Oh
when are you going to give the people more of what they want?
You know what?
That's going to blow up your Instagram more than anything else.
That might
you know what,
be
Matt? I'm gonna do that today. I'm gonna do it today.
Excellent.
What's today? Today is Friday,
the 5th.
March 5th. Yeah, March 5th, Friday, 2021. It is 2:22 Central. I'm gonna do it today. For anybody that's listening to this, so it's gonna happen today within the next hour.
There we go. That's the one the biggest question, because I was like on your Instagram earlier because I was looking for stuff. And I was like, yeah, he used to post lip syncing videos all the time. And like, I looked at the story highlight, and it's like 109 weeks ago and then 32 weeks ago. I'm like, we need to bring this back. These were so good.
That's because we do.
And like,
I fell off a little bit.
And like, for those of you guys listening, like, go watch the story highlight, because he's like very, very good at it and gets like super into it. And it's like really, really, and like, but that's one of the things. And the reason why I brought this up is because like, when we talked earlier about social media and you just being like authentically who you are, like that's an authentic part of who you are that most people probably wouldn't expect. And a lot of other people probably wouldn't have the courage to even post or do something like that with. So I think that's a cool thing for people to see who are also aspiring to be into the same area, because they'll listen to a podcast with you and like, you're such an intelligent person and you're so well spoken with stuff, but at the same time, you're also like, you can be a total complete fool when you're lip syncing and having a great time. And I think that like showing that level of duality is a hugely important thing for people to understand, that like there's a lot more that goes on with a person than just what you hear on social media. And the person is a lot deeper than that. So I think like there was an actual point for me wanting to bring this up, because it's something that like, it brings me joy to watch them. And it brings, and like, I know like it also would probably, like, people who are nervous of doing something authentic or posting something like that online would see somebody else who they respect tremendously do it, who's highly intelligent, very well spoken, and very highly respected in the field, see that and go like, oh, okay, well, I can do that. I can do stuff like this too, and I don't have to worry about it.
He's singing into a stir spoon right now.
Yeah, exactly.
It's no, man, I love that, man. Wow, I really appreciate that. I think you've ignited a fire. I'm ready to go now.
I'll take it.
I'm about to have a concert today. I'm telling you.
I will say that I was super happy for you when you transitioned to the NBA, but your content has definitely decreased since then.
Yes.
Like
yes.
You're clearly
substantially.
you're very busy.
Yeah.
And selfishly, I do miss the content creation.
Yeah, me too.
As well. So that's the downside for us, is your
I try to. That's usually when I post too, it's things that just kind of come to my mind based off of conversation or thoughts that I'm having or something that I've heard. So that even that part is relatively authentic, and I really want it to be something that's purposeful. But as you said, it's challenging to do that now. But I'm definitely looking forward to, especially this summer, right, when we have a break and some more downtime, to start putting more stuff out there, and probably even start writing a little bit more in regard to like just blogs and articles, stuff that's a little bit more thought out also.
Awesome. So if you want to be found, where can everybody find you?
Yeah, the easiest place is Instagram, Dr. J. Fit Boyd. Also, I'm a lecturer with the Continuing Education company, R2P Academy. So you can find me on there as well, R2PAcademy.com. And that's really where we're trying to, quote unquote, bridge this gap in regard to strength and conditioning, physical preparation, and reconditioning, and just laying down the foundation of scientific principles, as well as giving some tangible methods and tactics that are going to go under the umbrella of these different principles. So there's lecture, there's lab components, and then there's also critical thinking breakout components as well. It's a really, really great course that combines a lot of different aspects within the entire movement industry.
Fantastic. That's really cool. We'll link both of those in the show notes as well.
I appreciate it. This has been great.
Dr. Boyd, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Definitely.